The title of this talk is The Problem of Evil and Suffering from an Engineering Perspective, and it looks at the idea of applying reverse engineering techniques to the human condition and the human being to see if reverse engineering techniques and methodology is useful in making sense of the human condition. If God is all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful, why does He allow evil? Perhaps this is an improper use of the shopping mall information booth, but perhaps it is a proper use of the Engineering and Metaphysics Conference. Perhaps you've seen this work by Gary Larson. God, as a kid, tries to make a chicken in the lab. When I first saw that, I thought it was pretty funny, and then I remembered Genesis 6:5, where this is really a hard scripture. God looked down on the earth, He saw all that He had made, and He was sorry that He made man, because His heart was only evil all the time. Yikes! That's a difficult scripture, isn't it? Is God a poor creator? Is He incompetent? This is something that turns out one of the most difficult questions for Christians, I think, to wrestle with and to be able to articulate an answer to those who ask this question. I think it's an important thing for us to consider. And I wonder if engineering, the field of engineering, has a role to play in these kinds of questions. A recent article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Footprints of Non-Sentient Design Inside the Human Genome by John A. Weiss. And of course, non-sentient means not having the power of perception, not conscious, not characterized by sensation or consciousness. And, footprints instead of fingerprints, where fingerprints would infer some precise, accurate, detailed, eloquent work, but footprints is sloppy, not careful, not even conscious in this sense. So it's just apparent design that he's talking about. It's mainly because of wasteful elements in the human genome that appear to be wasteful, klutzy, kludgy type aspects of the human genome in his opinion, and then overtly malfunctioning aspects of the genome that cause untold pain and suffering in the way of diseases and things. So these are good questions that are brought up. In another paper, we attempted to respond to this assertion about the human genome by bringing up the possibility that was never considered in this paper of corruption. A classic example of corruption in the way of reverse engineering for an artifact is the Antikythera mechanism, which was brought up off the coast of Greece about 100 years ago. Coral-encrusted block of, didn't know what it was, but it took about 100 years and some high-tech reverse engineering to finally figure out it was an astrolabe, one of these devices that was the first analog computer, they're thinking, that was able to predict the motion of the heavens, predict the times of eclipses and the phases of the moon. But they had to tease apart the corruption from the original design. And this is something that's done regularly within reverse engineering projects, and it's probably done quite a bit in software reverse engineering and hardware, computer hardware reverse engineering as well. Now, this idea of applying reverse engineering to natural systems and even biological systems is not my idea. The National Academy of Engineering issued their 14 grand challenges for the 21st century, and one of them was reverse engineering the human brain. And there's many biologists, and this is regardless of faith or non-faith beliefs, many biologists are now claiming that systems biology and reverse engineering of natural systems is the way to go, because they find out the most, they unravel how these things work by treating them as if they were engineered systems. Even E.O. Wilson uses those exact words in his book, Consilience. In order to get the most out of these systems and understand how they work, we should treat them as if they were engineered systems. The problem is the complexity, as you might imagine. And so Jonathan Meyer has introduced a new concept called affordance-based reverse engineering. And the idea then is to use systems thinking and user interactions and the complexities therein require engineers to move beyond simply designing or reverse engineering for product function. He suggests that the concept of affordance, that is, what a system provides to an end user, or what one part of a system provides to another part of a system in order to provide something to an end user if it's a complex system. And this is an underlying and unifying principle in the science and design of reverse engineering. Donald Norman, who wrote the book The Design of Everyday Things, says that affordances provide strong clues as to the operations of things. And so Jonathan Meyer and George Fadell have written a work that talks about a relational theory of design as an alternative with greater potential for explanatory power and a framework for solving a wider array of problems. We propose that a relational theory of design is needed. Such a relational theory should mirror those created in mathematics, physics, computer science, and even philosophy. Here's their big picture of design. It involves three entities: the designer, the artifact which is designed, and the user. And these three, there are interesting relationships between all three of these entities. And this is what they call the big picture for design. But we're suggesting that in the area of reverse engineering, there's a fourth entity. Besides the designer, the artifact, and the user, there's the investigator or the reverse engineer. Affordances are also key to capturing important interactions during reverse engineering studies between these four entities. Now, if you think about applying this to natural systems, Richard Swinburne, philosopher of religion at the University of Oxford, in his book The Existence of God, talks about the affordances that are presented by the mind-body system. Sense organs with great capacity to receive information exist in a human being. An information processor to turn sensory data into brain states. A memory bank to file states correlated with past experiences. These allow us to reason as well as have beliefs. Brain states that give rise to desires, both good and evil. We have other brain states caused by various purposes that we have, and then we have a processor to turn these brain states into body movements. We have other states in our brain that seem to be not fully determined by other physical states, allowing free choice. All of this set of capabilities or apparatus gives us the affordances to affect the world, affect others, and even affect ourselves for good or for ill. And these affordances tell of meaning and purpose, as John Pickering says in his article in the CCC. Affordances are signs that point to something significant. Now, Jonathan Meyer suggests that with any complex system, you can reverse engineer it with the help of an affordance structure matrix. An affordance structure matrix simply lists the components of the system across the horizontal row across the top, and the resulting affordances, both positive or negative, across to the left. And then whatever parts of the system contribute to that affordance, you can put an X in the box to indicate the amount of interconnectivity between the different parts of the system in providing each of the affordances. So these are the affordances of the mind-body system. Now these are significant indicators of, I would suggest, purpose. Now maybe meaning is the wrong word in thinking about some of the things you've said, Dr. Sitch. Perhaps implications is a better word there. That these affordances provide implications or suggest certain implications. Something else that's been on my mind is the way people have been using the word magic in terms of explaining the natural realm. Walter Thiering, Cosmic Impressions, Traces of God in the Laws of Nature, says, chemical forces are able to create the most astounding things out of atoms as if by magic. Life continues this process and takes it to the extreme. Richard Dawkins recently has written a book called The Magic of Reality. And perhaps you know this famous quote by Ed Philpotts. The universe is full of magical things, patiently waiting for our wits to grow sharper. The reason I bring this up is because you might have heard of Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001, A Space Odyssey. You know Arthur C. Clarke's third law? Anybody?
Sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from matter.
Very good, Eric. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Perhaps nature is profitably viewed as God's advanced technology from our perspective. But there's also a corollary to this that relates to the theodicy issue. Corollary to Arthur C. Clarke's third law has to do with this kind of event. Is this something positive or something negative?
Yes. Depends on your perspective. It's a scalpel.
It depends on the context, doesn't it? It depends on some background information. Any sufficiently advanced technology may also be confused with malevolence. Think of a medical missions team going into the jungle and coming across a native who's deathly ill with appendicitis. It's diagnosed and they begin to intervene, operate. You can imagine that their uneducated friends of the native are thinking, oh, this is going to be even worse than he's already in. No way are you going to allow you to plunge that knife into his abdomen. But it's just because they're limited in their knowledge and understanding of advanced technology. Recently I came across this book too about the importance of images in understanding, the importance of placing the theism, naturalism discussion within the broader context of reflection on imagination and aesthetics. It's images, in this world we have a series of images and observations that create understanding of reality. And as I was teaching a course in the history of quantitative thought the last couple of years, one of the years I used James Robert Brown's book, The Philosophy of Mathematics, a contemporary introduction to the world of proofs and pictures, where he says, quote, "Some pictures are not really pictures, but rather are windows to Plato's heaven." Turns out Dr. Brown is an atheist, but he still believes in Plato's heaven. And here are a few examples of picture proofs. You might have seen this one on Pythagorean's theorem. The idea is that just from looking at the images, a conviction is established as to the truth of the proof. Here's another one that may not be. How would you prove that? That's a difficult, for me as an engineer and not a mathematician, I don't know if I could prove that through a rigorous step-by-step mathematical development. But a simple picture proof goes like this. Take a square one by one, split it into fourths. They take one of those squares, split that into fourths, and proceed accordingly. And when you look at what results in the colored squares, that's exactly 1/3 of the entire unit. The picture produces conviction. Here's another one. I tell the students, an infinite number of mathematicians walks into a bar. The first mathematician orders a beer. The second mathematician orders a half a beer. The third mathematician orders a fourth of a beer. The fifth and the bartender says, "Stop, stop, I got it. And he pours 2 beers. How did the bartender know? Well, I don't know if a joke can be a proof, but a picture can be a proof. And here's the result for that. Here's an example from Ludwig Wittgenstein in one of his early writings on the philosophy of mathematics. He said, while a point A describes a circle, B describes a figure 8. Now we write this down as a proposition in kinematics. We can say that proof must show the existence of an internal relation. The picture proof is an instrument producing conviction. And perhaps you can see here pretty easily that when point A traces out a circle, point B traces out a figure 8. Does everybody see that? There's only one problem here. This proof is wrong. This picture is inaccurate. It's misdrawn. If you look at it a little more closely, you can see that when A is up at the top, B should not be out there at the end. Here's the point that Brown makes, and he uses this point in the book. The picture, flawed though it is simply an aid to the understanding. It triggers the grasping of the sense. Thus, as a picture, it need not be accurate. It need only lead to the sense, the Platonic entity. When I saw this, it just got me thinking about how we sense something is flawed in our world, and yet we know from Romans 1:20 that we can see God's attributes through what He has made. And even though it may be flawed, our world may be flawed, perhaps it was intended to be something like a picture proof of God and His existence and care for us. Perhaps you know the story of Aptos Law. Fyodorov was a Russian eye doctor back in the early part of this century, last century. I came across an accident case where a young child had fallen off a bike. The child had worn glasses, and it was part of the glass had broken and cut his eye. Something very strange happened, though. After the doctor treated him and he was healed somewhat from the accident, he could see better than he could before the accident. In fact, he didn't need glasses anymore. This was the beginning of, thanks to Dr. Fyodorov, of radiokeratotomy. So we see an example right here in our own lives of how something that was painful, a suffering, actually turned out to cause much good to occur. Psalm 119 says, "It was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees." There's something significant about this journey of struggle, suffering, that appears to be necessary for our important aspect of our education in this world. The law from your mouth is more precious to me than thousands of pieces of gold or silver.
So are you saying that mostly what appears to be evil to us is more God operating on us in some way? Is that, if you're saying that, can you explain at least some of the evil we see in the world?
It argues from our limited understanding, our limited knowledge of all of reality, places us in a position where that's a possibility, isn't it? And we see, if I will, again, kind of shadows of that in the natural world, how adversity does build strength, does provide opportunities for us to grow in compassion, in love for others. Swinburne even mentions this in his book, how evil and suffering in the world provide significant opportunities for us to grow in the ways that spiritually and according to Jesus are good ways to grow.
And then what do you think would be, do you also think there are things that are actually evil, like actual malevolence?
Oh, certainly. I think evil is a real.
Right. So what would be a distinguishing factor
between that and what?
And between actual malevolent evil and things that just look back to us but God or are they kind of the same thing?
Apparently, from Scripture, it seems that God is able to take the evil that occurs and draw good out of it. Didn't Augustine say that?
For all things work for the good.
Yeah, Romans 8:28. But also, Augustine said God thought that better to, instead of that no evil would exist at all, rather that He would draw good out of evil. And that's a characteristic of good engineering. You ever heard the engineering phrase, let's make the devil work for us here? My dad used to say that when something would go wrong with an invention of his. He would sometimes be able to figure out how to turn it around and cause it to work for good. Alexander, you got a thought?
Who's the guy that was on Obama's staff that became, what's his name, that became the mayor of Chicago? You remember his...
Rahm Emanuel.
Yeah, you remember his
Yes.
statement?
What?
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes.
Anyway, that's not it. Can I suggest the following progression? First of all, in a broad, very general sense, I think you're spot on in terms of the connection that you drew to between engineering and the question of evil. My only kind of, I don't want to call it an issue, my kind of suggestion would be to maintain that it's an analogous connection. It's not a direct connection. Okay. There's a progression in terms of understanding evil, and the first part of that is that evil is not a thing, it's a privation of good.
Mm-hmm.
So evil is actually a certain lack of good. And then the second part of that, by implication, is that since God stepped back at creation and said, this is good, he was not the creator of evil. His creatures, so to speak, analogously speaking, created evil because they deprived the good of what it was. They did evil things, meaning they didn't do good things.
Right. But God created the potential for that by creating free will creatures.
Right. Then, hold on, let me finish the progression. And then the third thing is how do you resolve evil? Right? That's the third point in the progression. It's one thing to theoretically talk about evil. It's a whole different ballgame when you're actually trying to existentially deal with and practice. Well, how do you get rid of evil? You do good. That's the difficult part. And so God's ultimate answer to evil in this world is the thing that we can't do. It's a gratuitous gift. It's the cross. Right? Evil is in fact way overcome by the cross, the thing which is the most evil. I mean, we, the creatures of God, committed deicide. We committed deicide, and God was able to bring good out of even something that evil. That I think that's the Augustinian kind of progression of the line.
I would argue that we didn't necessarily create evil, though, by doing it. We just partook in it, because when we ate of the tree, it was not the tree that created, the fruit that created good and evil because we ate it. It was the tree that gave us knowledge of good and evil. And so by disobeying God for the first time, he was forced to not be in direct connection with us, guiding us like he was before. But it was a double-edged sword. We lost direct connection with God, but at the same time gained the knowledge of what we needed to do to at least stumble through figuring out where to go. But before, we didn't have any knowledge of good and evil, and it was just reliance on God's direction. He was guiding us around, not doing the evil. Evil was there. We were just not doing it because we relied on God.
Well, I'm not sure I would agree that we gained the knowledge of where to go, because we didn't gain the
knowledge of where to go. We gained the knowledge that there was a good place to go and a bad place to go. Because we weren't in direct connection with God anymore, because we sinned by eating the fruit, by disobeying God. He wasn't able to guide us anymore. But he left us with the knowledge that, well, yes, there is a good and there is a bad. You have to figure it out now, because you sinned and I have to turn my face away from you. So it was kind of a double-edged sword.
Yes.
This is just an association or a comment. I remember some maybe apologists mentioned that a lot of people or atheists are asking how come that bad things happen to good people. And he said, why don't you ask the question, how come that good things happen to bad people?
That's a good point. Good point. Yes.
There's an old, I'm trying to remember where I read this from, but there was an old saying that evil is merely God concealed, which kind of goes back to what you were saying here. Because we cannot see God's will in something happening and we perceive it as bad, we call it evil.
Mm-hmm.
And a scriptural reference of God redeeming an evil thing is Joseph,
mm-hmm.
where he specifically says, what you have meant for evil, God has meant for good.
Yeah. Very good.
So then your answer to someone who brings up the problem of evil would be that evil doesn't disprove the existence of God because God allows it to bring an even greater good about?
Well, I wouldn't presume to give such a bad answer in the first place.
But something along those lines.
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem, and especially for someone. Now, I just saw a book yesterday written by a guy named Lockheed, whose son committed suicide. This is an engineer, a PhD. Forget where he's at, but the name of the book is Science and Spirituality, Ramblings of a Grieving Engineer, something like that. And this is the person who wrote this book just the year after his college-age son had committed suicide in his freshman year. It's just a sad, sad story. You know, a very promising young life. And his dad writes this book. I'm dying to get a hold of it, and I think it'll help. Because it's one thing for me to propose an answer to this question of evil, pain, and suffering, but I think I'd like to hear from this guy who just has gone through one of the worst things you can absolutely go through, and get his perspective. And he's an engineer too, so I'm curious to know what he says.
Yeah, and one has to be careful because evil, using that term very generically, may be nothing more than the natural consequence of a stupid decision. If I go running out in Alaska wilderness directly after a shower in January, I freeze to death.
Right. Well, that brings up the point of purpose also. Yes. When I think of a screwdriver that's sometimes used as a pry bar, and it breaks because it was never intended by the original designer for it to be used like that. Perhaps there's something similar going on with human beings, and that's why we see so much corruption in the world.
I apologize for doing a second comment. I don't mean to be usurping, especially your time. Classically, the problem of evil has always been the most intractable. It's the most difficult problem to deal with because people actually experience existentially what evil is, like this poor engineer with the suicide of his son. And it's also the question that's thrown back into the face of Christians. You know, the Fukushima. Where was God in Fukushima? And when the problem with that, with asking that question, is the focus is always on the person that's asking the question, rather than the almost blatantly obvious, but the one that we seem to miss all the time response. Where is God? He's on the cross, suffering with us. That's the only really acceptable God we want, not some distant theory thing. He's the one that made himself like us, condescended for our redemption. I mean, that's the beauty of,
right.
It's actually stunning in how God blew Satan out of the water.
Ultimately conquering the problem of evil and
exactly
eliminating it.
Right.
It reminds me of the read where after the Holocaust, rabbis put God on trial for the Holocaust.
Right.
Saw that movie.
And they came out and realized it wasn't that, God, they decided the question really was, why did he allow the Holocaust to occur? How come it didn't happen way back when? Because they were so guilty of crimes against God.
When talking about the problem of evil, I think it's helpful to distinguish between what in your abstract is given as a logical problem, and then there's a probabilistic problem, and then there's the emotional problem, or the existential problem. And you would offer different answers to the different forms. But you also run into the problem of if turning the tables on perhaps one aspect, is evil objective, or is it merely a subjective reaction to circumstances? And the only way I can see for it to be objective is if there's an objective good that's being deprived. So the presence of objective evil is actually an argument for the existence of God. And then, so there's lots of different aspects to it. What I tell my students all the time is, you talk about the problem of evil before somebody suffers. You don't want to be Job's friend.
Right.
I mean, and explain to them
right.
How what they're experiencing is evil really isn't, or whatever. No. Job's friends blame it on Job. So we need to make those distinctions. The logical problem's actually been resolved. And in philosophy, they don't actually make that argument.
So it's the existential problem that remains.
Or the probabilistic problem. And how much evil. The loving God won't allow this much. And there are. So I think Christianity is uniquely situated to deal with the problem, because as you mentioned, we have the cross, whereas other religious traditions have.
Well, thank you very much for your attention.